Faith is a presupposition for living in the truth. And then you might ask yourself another question, which is, well, why bother living in the truth? Well, one answer would be so that reality doesn't rise up and smite you repeatedly, which it will, if you're deceptive. So that's one answer, but here's another answer, and this is a better answer. People ask themselves all the time, what's the purpose of life? And there's a variety of answers to that. There's no purpose. We're just atoms on a dust mote at the edge of a rather reprehensible corner of the cosmos, and we exist for a moment and we're out, and that's that. Or we're so lost in a plethora of subordinate meanings that we're confused and aimless. Or we want to be hedonistically happy, and I would say that's really the offer that's on the table in our culture most of the time. It's like, well, I just want to be happy. And people will say that to you. It's a slogan. It's the most common slogan of our time, I would say, and it's such a preposterous slogan. It's like, what do you mean just? You just want to be happy. That's all. That's all you want. That absolute impossibility. You want bliss unending no matter what you do, and that's all you want. It's not exactly a small ask, let's say, because it's the same thing as asking to dwell permanently in paradise. It's something like that. So it's not that likely. And then it also isn't true. That isn't what you want. If you do careful analysis of what people mean when they say they just want to be happy, what they mean is they don't want to suffer stupidly. We're much more concerned with not experiencing an excess of negative emotion than we are with experiencing a surfeit of positive pleasure. So first of all, we don't mean we just want to be happy. We mean, please don't make us too miserable. And fair enough, that's reasonable. But then even on the happiness front, even on the absence of misery front, that's not true. One of the things Dostoevsky pointed out in Notes from Underground, which is so bloody brilliant, he was criticizing the idea of materialist utopia. He said something like, well, imagine we made our materialist utopian dreams come true, and everybody had enough to eat all the cakes they wanted and enough to drink and nothing to do, he said, but busy themselves with the continuation of the species. And we were so pleased that we emitted nothing but bubbles of bliss. He said, human beings were so damn ungrateful that the first thing we do is take a stick and smash up all that comfortable prosperity just so that something unexpected and provocative could happen. And that's very smart. You know, that's hearkening in some sense back to the story of the Garden of Eden and the proclivity of human beings to eat the forbidden fruit. It's like, it isn't obvious at all that we want happiness. It isn't even obvious that we want absence of misery. What's really obvious is that we want an adventure. We want an adventure that's so compelling that it makes the misery of life not just justifiable, but worthwhile. You want to look back on your life, you know. You want to look back on your life, and you know this to be true. You want to be able to say to yourself, even considering a month or a week or a series of days, you want to be able to say, that was really difficult, but you know what? It was worth it. And I think that's what you want from your life. It's something like, you know what? That was difficult, but it was worth it. And that meant that the adventure was so great that it justified the difficulties. And so then the question is, and here's the question, where do you find the great adventure of your life? Well, how about in truth? Well, why? Because you don't know what's going to happen if you tell the truth. It's a mystery. It's going to lay itself out for you. And so that's an adventure, because you literally do not know what's going to happen. You have to let go of knowing what's going to happen. And so then you have that adventure, and then what is also the case is that it's you that's having the adventure. right? Because if what you're doing is living in truth, that's you. That truth is you. And so that means that whatever happens when you tell the truth is your adventure. And then you think, well, I'm using deception. It's like, well, maybe you are, but maybe deception is using you. And then maybe it's the spirit of deception that's having the adventure of your life. And then you might ask yourself, well, why are you so miserable and unhappy? And the answer would be, well, the spirit of deception is having the adventure of your life. You're not even there. Because if you're not living in truth, you're not there. Obviously, what's there is the spirit of deception. And you might think that's your deception, but I would be very careful about thinking that, because there have been centuries of meditation on the nature of the spirit of deception. And the answer isn't that the spirit of deception is you. The answer is that the spirit of deception is something that possesses you and convinces you that it's you. And that's not something you want to fall into the clutches of. So now you have to tell me the question again.
I'm certain you answered it. This was about teenagers.
Oh, yes. Well, back to the teenagers. Do you not want to go to college, or are you just lying about being lazy? So that's a question, and we can ask ourselves that question. And as I said, on the teenage front, craft a vision, craft a compelling vision. That's really what we are as human beings, is we're visionaries. That's how we confront the horizon of the future. We meet the horizon of the future by crafting a compelling vision. And your vision might not involve a college education, but it should be a vision that makes you think, if I could make that come true, it would justify the trouble that it would take to manage it. And I think that's the right attitude to take towards your life. And we're all going to have our crosses to bear in the most fundamental manner. We all have to deal with the catastrophe of mortality. And I think we all have to deal with the reality of hell. And you can think about that religiously or not. Political hell will do for hell as far as I'm concerned. We certainly saw no shortage of evidence for that in the 20th century. And we all have to contend with that, right? The reality of mortality and the reality of hell. And then we all have to contend with the fact that we have to develop a vision for our life that is so compelling that it justifies those bitter realities. God calls people to the adventure of their lives. And so you could say, in part, God is that force within you which calls you to the adventure of your life. And it says, get away from your family, get away from your blind and unconscious comfort, and get the hell out there in the world. Well, God calls Abraham out from his fathers, where he stayed far too long, and from his kin, where it's secure. And the first thing he encounters is a famine, and then he encounters a tyranny inhabited by people who want to steal his wife. It's like you think, well, Abraham should have just stayed in bed and ignored God, obviously. Well, that isn't how it is. It's like we're built for struggle, us human beings. You're not after the bubbles of bliss that Dostoevsky described in Notes from Underground. We're built to contend with the world. We're built to contend with reality. You want a challenge, and the best way that you can take on a challenge, because a challenge fortifies you. So you don't want to be secure, you want to be strong. And you get strong by taking on optimal challenges. And so you lay out your destiny in the world, and you take the slings and arrows of fate, and you make yourself stronger while you're doing so. And you might fail, and fortune might do you in, but it's your best bet. One of the things that my family has learned, because we've been the targets of many serpentine attacks, is that we could turn an attack into an opportunity if we were careful, if we looked for the opportunity, if we could see the adversarial force even as it's very stretching things to say this, but as something to be grateful for. It is definitely the case that the journalists who've attacked me the most viciously have been the most profound contributors to my success. Well, isn't that strange though, right? Because that isn't what you'd think. And so what we learned was that when we were attacked, if we could hold our ground and try to, I don't mean seek naively for the silver lining in the sort of sense that this is the best of all possible worlds in that Panglossian sense, but to turn even adversarial challenge into a field of opportunity, that's a practice, right? It's something you can get better and better at. And in any situation, no matter how difficult, perhaps it's your ability to seek out what you could be humbly grateful for that will guide you through it. So imagine, I've seen this when people were encountering death. So when my wife's mother died, she died of a terrible degenerative neurological condition akin to Alzheimer's. And it was pretty damn brutal because neurological diseases are pretty brutal. And so we just lost pieces of her, day by day for 15 years. And it was quite the catastrophe for the family, but it was something to watch too, because her husband, Del Roberts, my father-in-law, who was quite the man about town in our little town. He was like the most extroverted person in the whole town. And he is quite the party animal and a great guy, great sense of humor. He cared for his wife so diligently that it was really a miracle to watch. And his children were grateful to him for that, and it increased their love for him. And as she died, and then when she died, the family looked at each other and realized what they had in each other, and they pulled together in quite a remarkable way, dispensing with many of the unpleasant and unnecessary fractious disagreements that had destroyed their unity or had impaired their unity. They had a pretty good family, but no family is perfect. They came together in this time of death, and it was partly because they looked around to see what they had that they could be grateful for. And what was so interesting about that was that it was a balm, B-A-L-M, for the death itself. It isn't like my mother-in-law's death was nothing. It wasn't like that didn't tear a hole in the fabric of the family's being, but because they were able to orient themselves to what was good that they had with themselves, which in some sense was an infinite resource that they could draw on, as of yet unrevealed possibilities of love to provide them with succor through their grief. And then that became permanent. And so you just don't know, how skillful could you get if one of the things you practiced was gratitude? And then you can also think of it not as a form of naivety, because naive people can be grateful because they don't know better, but as a form of courage, right? Because the world is a terrible and formidable place, and you have real adversaries, and sometimes deadly adversaries in nature and in culture. And if you can cultivate that sense of rigorous gratitude, then God only knows what you could extract even from the worst of situations. And don't you need to know how you could best extract what was best from the worst of situations? And gratitude is one of the virtues that allows you to do exactly that. And so it's worth practicing, right? It's a practice. It's a courageous practice. It's not just something you should do, right? It's something that illuminates everything, to see the mystery and beauty in things, even in moments of tragedy. That's a real art, It's the art of great artists to do that. In the Brothers Karamazov, for example, it's pretty obvious that Ivan, who is the atheistic and charismatic brother, Karamazov, is the intellectual superior to Alyosha, and also he's superior rhetorically. He makes one of the best cases for atheism on moral grounds that has ever been made in literature. But Alyosha is by far the more morally superior character. And you experience that moral superiority implicitly by watching how he manifests himself in the book. It's not an intellectual argument, it's an argument of narrative. And so Dostoevsky can show how the properly oriented soul can defeat even the sharpest rational intellect. And Dostoevsky explores that again in The Idiot, because Mishkin is a savior figure. And although in some sense you might say he loses all the battles, he wins the war. And that's a useful thing to know about your life, is that, but this is, for example, I think why it requires faith to tell the truth. And why faith is a necessity. Faith is a necessity because you don't know what you're doing. And you can't in any final sense, so you have to always leap into the darkness. You have no choice. Well, you do. You can not leap into the darkness, but then the darkness just engulfs you. So that's a choice, but it's not a good one. Because you're ignorant in some fundamental sense, and because the future differs from the past, you have to leap into the unknown with principle. And one principle can be that the truth will set you free. And then the question is, well, how is that manifest? You say, well, I get in trouble when I tell the truth. It's like, yeah, fair enough. You also get in trouble when you don't tell the truth. You get to choose between the kinds of trouble, but you don't get to dispense with trouble itself. And the thing, what you have to decide this, is that if you build a world based on truth around you, is that the best of all possible worlds? And you can't use any given outcome to inform that, because many times when you say what you have to say, the first response is going to be trouble. And you'll think, well, I should have just lied. And why do you lie? Well, you lie so you don't get in trouble, obviously. Or you lie because you want to gain something that's not yours by right. And so you take this short-term approach to extracting order from chaos, and you think that's a victory, but it's not. It's a loss. But the loss is in some sense only demonstratable by faith, right? Is the world that you extract using truth the best possible world? You have to stake your life on that to find out. There's no other way of finding out. So, and that's what Mishkin does in The Idiot. And so everyone thinks he's an idiot, but what did Carl Jung say? The fool is the precursor to the savior. And that's true in many, many ways. It's many, many ways. And so, naive people blurt out the truth because they don't know any better, but wise people tell the truth because they know it's the best way forward. And both of them might look like fools, but that doesn't mean that they are. So, can you get a job or a career? Can you educate yourself? Can you regulate the draw of temptation, drug and alcohol use in particular, sexual temptation as well? Oh, do you do anything that's remotely resembling civic responsibility? Are you a member of a political party? Do you go to church? I don't go to church because, their beliefs don't match mine. It's like, who the hell cares about your beliefs? You're like 16. You don't even have beliefs. And if you think it's like you're right and the Catholic Church is wrong, well, good luck with that attitude. And that isn't to say that the church, for example, or a political party doesn't need repair, because all institutions are always falling apart and corrupt. That's a story as old as time. That's the evil uncle. But good, you have something to do. Go fix it up. Definition of man. What am I, a biologist? But as it happens, I am a biologist, so I guess I don't have that excuse. Productive generosity is good. I once read a good description of Christian charity, and it was productivity plus generosity, which I really liked, because the hyper empathic types only concentrate on the generosity end of that. It's like, I'm generous, yeah, but like, do you have any money? No, I'm generous with other people's money. Yeah, well, you're missing half the equation there. And that's really the distinction between conscientiousness and agreeableness from a personality perspective. Those are two cardinal personality traits. And agreeableness, which is basically an empathy dimension, has no correlation whatsoever with success in enterprise, business, creative domains. In fact, among managers, agreeableness looks like it's slightly negatively correlated with success, because hyper-agreeable managers can't say no. They can't discipline their employees. They can't set limits. And they're susceptible to manipulation. So productive generosity is pretty good.
There is more to it, obviously, more to being a man than productive generosity, but as a central notion, that's a good one. The productivity requires aim, orientation, responsibility, discipline, all of that willingness to work, that willingness to make sacrifices, which is the hallmark of maturity in the service of a higher goal. And that responsibility, the productive responsibility, should manifest itself in relationship to the individual. So you should be responsible to yourself and your future self, the community of selves that you are across time. And then you should be responsible for and productive for as many people as you can manage. And so that might be first your intimate partner, your wife, second your parents, your siblings, your children, maybe your children primarily, although, there's a trade-off there with your wife. Then your local community, then your broader community. You want to take on all that responsibility if you can, in a sense that's both productive and generous, that gives you something to do. Justify your miserable life to yourself and everyone else, and you need to do that. It orients you solidly in the world if you do that, and it gives you a dragon to fight, a real one, and that's where the gold is. So, as everyone has known forever, and as we continue to remind ourselves, how should you arm yourself? Well, that's kind of what a humanities education teaches you to some degree. Arm yourself with words. Be precise in your language. Right? Say what you mean. Read great men and great women. Make yourself literate. Get your tongue in order. Get it under your own control. Get rid of the ums and the likes and the you knows and the pauses. And get rid of everything you say that you only say to impress other people. And just see if you can say what you believe to be true. That's an adventure. That's the thing about the truth, If you aren't speaking the truth, well, you got to ask yourself, if you're not speaking the truth, who is it that's talking? If you're saying something that you do not believe to be true, it's not you talking. It's something else. It might be the part of you that wants to manipulate the other person into delivering what you think you want from them. Well, what is that spirit of manipulation that you've allowed to possess you? It's not you. Let's say you decide to live your whole life in that instrumental manner. You're going to craft your words like the student who says, well, I'm going to write what the professor wants to hear so I get the grade. It's like, well, you just turn yourself into that. Well, who is it that's doing that manipulating? It's not you, because those aren't your words. So even if you get the grade, it's not you that got the grade. It's the false you. It's the manipulative you. So you do that your whole life. You don't have your life. And then you think, well, God, that was a miserable life. I manipulated everybody. They were so damn stupid. They were sucked in by it. They're all contemptible. Everyone does it, which they don't, by the way. And so that's a pathway to bitterness. Partly because if you're a manipulator and you use your language falsely, you don't live your own life. You live the life of whatever possesses you when you think it's you manipulating. And so you live the life of the spirit of manipulation. And there's no difference between that in some fundamental sense and demonic possession. So if that's what you want, go right ahead. But what you miss is the adventure of your own life. Because if you say what you think, this is a really important thing to understand. You have no idea what will happen if all you do is say what you think. Because you have to let go of everything. Just to do that, you have to assume that there isn't anything better that can happen than what happens if you tell the truth, no matter what happens. Because you say, I'll tell the truth and I get in trouble. It's like, well, is that good or bad? Well, it's not so good when it's happening. When you get in trouble, that can be devastating. But in the medium term or the long term, in my situation, I've gotten in trouble plenty of times for things I've said, and many times I thought, that was fatal, that was the end. I said something or it was misinterpreted, but often I said something that I was going to get taken out, I was going to get canceled, and that was the end of my reputation. And every single time, and I hope partly because I didn't say things that I didn't think were true, every single time it switched around. And so eventually, the cancellation attempt not only failed, but massively backfired. But man, living in that gap between when the pressure was on, let's say, and it turned around, that wasn't pleasant. But it's certainly adventurous because you don't know what's going to happen. And maybe that is the adventure of your life, right? Imagine that the world was constituted so that the true adventure of your life emerged as a consequence of truth in speech and action. Because that would be reflective of the real you, so it would be you living. And then imagine that the adventure that would occur if you dwelled in the truth would be so overwhelming that it would justify all the suffering. And I think that's true. The great people I know are brutally truthful to themselves and other people. And they have insanely adventurous lives. And they also get more and more and more competent. I've talked to my daughter a lot about this. My daughter runs my companies. My daughter didn't know much about business when she started, and she was pretty sick too, and she didn't know a lot. And so it was easy for people who thought they knew a lot about business to pull the wool over her eyes. But Michaela has the ability to ask stupid questions, and we've talked about that a lot. It's like, you only have to ask a stupid question once if you're alert. You ask a stupid question, and if you're in a crowd and you ask a stupid question, 80% of the people in the crowd have the same question. They're just too cowardly to ask. But you ask and then someone actually tells you, you never have to ask that question again.
In the story of Adam and Eve, God is not least. And this is God as character, or God as model for ritual emulation, or God as central narrative figure. That's another way of thinking about it. God is the spirit that you walk with when you're not self-conscious in a well-tended garden. Okay, so why do you have a garden? Precisely so you can do that. To forget about yourself for a minute, to engage in the apprehension of something balanced and beautiful, a walled garden, the proper integration of culture and nature, and the proper apprehension in that situation frees you of your self-conscious burden. And so for a moment you enter that transcendent state that's associated with the Edenic paradise. So that's God in that story. Later in the story of Adam and Eve, God is the spirit that calls you to conscience when, like Adam and Eve, you've bitten off more than you can chew. In the story of Cain and Abel, God is the spirit of conscience that calls to you when you've made improper sacrifices and are facing the consequence of your unwillingness to go all in on your life. In the story of Noah, God is the spirit that calls to you if you're wise when trouble is coming and you determine to batten down the hatches. In the story of Abraham, God is the spirit that calls the overprotected and unwilling, despite their resistance, out into the adventure of their life. In the story of Moses, God is the spirit that calls to those who are oppressed and in slavery to free themselves from the grip of tyranny, whether it's their psychological tyranny or whether it's the tyranny of the state. And so all of those stories point to an underlying transcendent unity of character, let's say, which is the proper model for worship and celebration and ritual emulation that's united, that's the antithesis to the, let's say, darker and more multiplicitous spirits that might rule the world. And part of the religious enterprise is the elaboration and understanding, and then the incorporation, ingestion, and modeling of that spirit in your own life. And to the degree that you do that, you do what the Logos did at the beginning of time in Genesis. You use truth, truthful speech, guided, let's say, by love, to confront the transforming horizon of the future, the chaos and potential of the transforming horizon of the future, and turn it into the habitable order that is good. And that's a manifestation of the image of God that man and women are made in.
There's a sacrificial element in maturation, right? You have to sacrifice the pluripotentiality of childhood for the actuality of a frame. And the question is, well, why would you do that? Well, one reason is it happens to you whether you do it or not. You can either choose your damn limitation,
or you can let it take you unaware when you're 30, or even worse when you're 40. And then that is not a happy day. I see people like this, and I think it's more and more common in our culture because people can put off maturity without suffering an immediate penalty. But all that happens is the penalty accrues, and then when it finally hits, it just wallops you. Because when you're 25, you can be an idiot. It's no problem. Even when you're out in a job search, it's like, well, you don't have any experience and you're kind of clueless. It's yeah, you're young, it's no problem. That's what young people are like, but they're full of potential. Okay, well now you're the same person at 30. It's like people aren't so thrilled about you at that point. It's like, what the hell have you been doing for the last 10 years? Well, I'm just as clueless as I was when I was 22. It's, yeah, but you're not 22. You're an old infant, right? And that's an ugly thing, an old infant. So, part of the reason you choose your damn sacrifice, because the sacrifice is inevitable, but at least you get to choose it. And then there's something that's even more complex than that in some sense, is that the problem with being a child is that all you are is potential, and it's really low resolution. You could be anything, but you're not anything. So then you go and you adopt an apprenticeship, roughly speaking, and then you become something. And when you're something, that makes the world open up to you again. Like if you're a really good plumber, then you end up being far more than a plumber, right? You end up being a good employer. Not that plumbers, I'm not putting plumbers down. It's like more power to plumbers. They've saved more lives than doctors. So, hygiene, right? So, if you're a really good plumber, well then you have some employees, you run a business, you train some other people, you enlarge their lives, you're kind of a pillar of the community, you have your family. Once you pass through that narrow training period, which narrows you and constricts you and develops you at the same time, then you can come out the other end with a bunch of new possibility at hand. And Jung talked about that. He thought that part of the proper path of development in the last half of life was to rediscover the child that you left behind as you were apprenticing. And so then you get to be something and regain that potential at the same time. Very, very smart. Well, he was very, very smart, so that's very wise. Responsibility in some sense, that's maturity, but I would also say that's the adventure of your life. And how is that tied to the idea of sacrifice? Well, what do you have to sacrifice if you're responsible? And the answer is you have to sacrifice your short-term, hedonic, and immature whims, right? So if you're a child, if you're 2, you're impulsive, and that means that you only act for the moment, and you only act in relationship to what it is that you, as a singular individual, want in that moment. And that's just not a tenable solution to the complexities of life, because you don't just exist in a moment. You exist as an iterated set of identities across time. You yourself are a community that extends across time, and you have to govern every action that you take in the present in relationship to the fact that you can do what you want tonight, man, but you got to put up with yourself tomorrow morning, and you got to put up with yourself for what you did tonight next week and next year and 5 years from now. And every single one of your actions is like that. And so in order to act properly, you have to sacrifice the impulsive gratification and the easy way out that's characteristic of the moment, and extend yourself across time so that you are acting in concert with the highest interest of yourself in the broadest possible range of contexts. And that's what it means to be an adult. And you do exactly the same thing with other people. In a relationship, in a marriage, you're not just who you say you are from moment to moment. You have to negotiate very carefully with your wife or with your husband on an ongoing basis, every week, every moment in some sense, while you're communicating, to understand not only how you can get what you need and you want, which may be necessary and important, especially in the long run, because you have to treat yourself properly, but so that you can do that in a way that your partner can also get what he or she needs and wants, in a way that makes both of you more likely to get what you need and want over the long span, and more so than you would get if you were alone. And if it wasn't the case, why would you bother with it? And then you have to incorporate children into that too, and that gets to be a more complex unity. So if there's 5 of you, well, how do you balance your individual needs and wants with that small collective? And that's the negotiation process that goes on in a family. And hopefully you do that too in the spirit of reciprocity and truth and love. And you take on that responsibility, and that's the core aspect of sacrifice. right? The great discovery of the human race. That's what sacrifice means. And you sacrifice the foolishness of yourself. You sacrifice the momentary foolishness of yourself to the highest good that you can possibly imagine. And there's nothing in that that isn't good, even though it's difficult. And that's not mere inhibition of those impulsive gratifications that, if only were allowed to be manifest fully, would set you free. Quite the contrary, you would have precisely the freedom of an extremely badly behaved 2-year-old. And that's no freedom at all, right? All that is freedom to wander in the street and get crushed by the first car that drives by. And there's nothing in that that's proper. Assumption number 2, peaceful social being is preferable to isolation and to war. In consequence, it justly and rightly demands some sacrifice of individual impulse and idiosyncrasy. Okay, so you want to live alone in the bush? You're going to starve to death and be eaten by black flies. It's not a good solution. Okay, so you have to cooperate with other people, and that means you can't get to be your whimsical self 100% of the time. It means that most of you has to be sacrificed so that you can be approximately like everyone else. Now, that's a real sacrifice, right? It's a sacrifice of it might even be a sacrifice of some of the unique qualities that everyone needs from you. Socialization costs, but the advantage of it is, well, we get to exist. Look, we can all sit together in this hall and no one has their hands around each other's throats, and we're talking about serious things. Okay, man, that's worth something. And what it's worth in part is you don't get to be whatever spectacularly colored creature you want to be all the time. You have to do what you can to be normal and predictable. And it's not like normal and predictable is the highest virtue, because it's not. And being more than normal and being unique and creative and contributing in that way is extraordinarily important. But the fundamental point is that social being requires the sacrifice of a certain amount of individual idiosyncrasy. And that's a fundamentally conservative claim. It's like you should do what everyone else does unless you have a really good reason to vary. It's a good rule. It's like you do what people have done throughout time. You grow up, you find a partner, you establish a stable relationship, you get a job, you make yourself useful, you have some children, you do something productive and interesting with your spare time, and you try to act like a respectable human being. That's what you do. That's a conservative ethos. And if you have something spectacular about you that needs to be revealed to the world, then break some rules, man. Go right ahead. I'm dead serious about that. But most of the time you don't. And even if you happen to be a special person, and you might be, 90% of you still isn't special. So most of the time you're still going to be following the rules. And the rules aren't there to oppress. They're there to keep us away from each other's throats. Because human beings are very warlike, and we're very competitive, and we're very aggressive. And if we are fortunate enough to have woven together a social fabric that basically renders us peaceful and cooperative, we should try disrupting that at our great peril. Because the general rule for human existence throughout the centuries has been turmoil and war. And we don't have that here. And so thank God for that. And it's worth a bit of a sacrifice. Someone else's rights are my responsibility, and vice versa. That almost defines the relationship between rights between people. And liberty is not the allowance to engage in every short-term hedonistic whim impulse. That's chaos. That's not liberty. Liberty is more like what occurs when you have skillful players who are all playing the same game. And game is a good model, right? Because the people who are playing a game, well, they want to play the game. So you're in a free association if you're playing a game. If you're compelled to play, it's not a game. So you have to do it freely. You have to do it voluntarily. You have to abide by a set of governing principles that lay out the domain for peaceful cooperation and competition within the game. Imagine a game of opposing teams, let's say. And so the rules underneath are the preconditions for the freedom of the game. And so liberty, if liberty is the playing of a game, which I think is an optimized description of liberty, then it has to take place within a set of agreed upon rules that set the playing field for the game. And there aren't an unlimited number of playable games. We know this not least because of attempts to produce multiplayer worlds online. Some multiplayer worlds degenerate into chaos and catastrophe because they turn out not to be iterable playable games. And so the universe of playable games is actually structured in some way that we don't fully explicitly understand, but it does abide by certain principles, like, well, for it to be a game, it has to be a game played by people who are voluntarily associating. And then there has to be a minimum number of principles that everyone understands. And there has to be some structure of hierarchical punishment and threat and reward. And you have to be a good loser, and you have to be a good winner, and you have to want to play the game again. And you have to facilitate the development of your teammates, all of that. And so liberty has to be construed not so much as the absence of super ego-like rules that are doing nothing but imposing upon your hedonic, narcissistic, biological whims, as more like the integral balancing of all your motivations and emotions within an iterable structure. That's a liberty. It's like a game. When God tells Moses to tell the Pharaoh to let the people go, that is not what he says. He does not say, tell Pharaoh to let my people go. He tells Pharaoh, let my people go so they may serve me in the wilderness. And that's repeated 10 times, which means that God means it, by the way, because that's why he says it 10 times. And it means something like, when you move from freedom and you move into chaos, all you've done is move from tyranny into the desert. And the desert's no better than the tyranny. That's why the Israelites get all fractious in the desert. That's why they wander around blindly for 40 years. It's like out of the tyranny where everything was ordered into the desert where nothing is ordered. It's like that's not an improvement. And whatever the promised land is, it's not the mere domain of narcissistic 2-year-old impulsive whims and freedoms. In that sense, I can do anything. It's like, well, no, you can't. No, you can't. And you don't even want to. Let's say you're miserable and unhappy. Okay, here's a cure. Find what's valuable and let it go. So we could say, well, maybe it's a relationship that you have. Maybe it's a relationship with your parents, right? And the relationship is pathological, but you're locked into it. You value it, and no wonder, because it's a relationship with your parents. And you're suffering terribly because of it. Well, what do? Maybe you let it go. It's a sacrifice. And the idea is that, well, that'll clear the future for you. Well, very frequently when people are suffering terribly, not always, because sometimes you just suffer stupidly, blindly, and without recourse. You get cancer and then you die. So we have no idea how to deal with that. But sometimes the reason that you're suffering is because you just won't let go of the thing that's biting you. And you think, well, I can't let go of, and I've had clients like this. I can't stop communicating with my mother, who phones me 3 times a day, every day of my life, and never says anything that isn't unbelievably critical and demeaning. I can't let that go. It's like, well, that's not such a good idea. The funny thing too, often when people let something like that go, it goes away, sorts itself out, and then comes back. So they don't even end up losing it. But unless they're willing to let it go, to sacrifice it, they make no headway whatsoever. And so one of the rules is, if people are impeding your development, you sacrifice your relationship with them, right? It's a very, very rough rule. The fact that certain things bother you, and you might think, I wish nothing bothered me. It's like, no, you don't really, because if nothing bothered you, in some sense that would be the same thing as not caring about anything. It actually turns out to be the case that the things that bug you are the things that you care about when they go wrong. And so then this is a really useful question to ask yourself, because you might be observing the political landscape and you think, that really bugs me. And maybe you annoy the hell out of your friends and your enemies and even yourself by, being obsessively concerned about that thing that bugs you. And then you might ask yourself, well, why does that bug you? Because there's like a million things that could in principle bother you. And maybe you're one of those people that has a million things bother you, but probably not. There's more things that don't bother you than that do bother you, because there's a lot of things. And if everything bothered you, you'd just die. Right? So there's very selective things that bother you, and it's very interesting because in some sense they choose you. Because you might say something like, I wish that didn't bother me. It's like, that's a very strange thing to say, because it begs the question, why then does that bother you? And also, why can't you control it, right? That's a very, this is part of the reason I loved reading the psychoanalysts, because the psychoanalysts knew, they're the first people who really cottoned onto this in a kind of technically sophisticated manner. They knew that we were, in part, collections of autonomous sub-personalities, and that those sub-personalities could take control of us. And that's really what happens when something bugs you. It's something autonomous that has a will and an agency, takes control of you, and forces you to attend, despite yourself sometimes. And why should you attend? Because that's your destiny calling you, right? That's your problem. And that's a good thing to know, because people ask themselves, where do I find the meaning in my life? I would say, well, are there things that bother you? Yes, those are your problems. And you might say, well, I don't want those to be my problems. Like, hey, did someone ask you? It's just how it happens. And so then, why is that relevant to writing? Why don't you write about something that bothers you? And try to figure it out. Because you got to ask yourself, well, first of all, what would your life be like if you actually addressed the things that bothered you, right? And say, well, political things bother me. It's like, maybe you have a political duty that's calling to you. I mean, why not? Someone has to, and you're a citizen. Could be you, and not just an interest, right? And not just an obsession, but an obligation and a responsibility. And God only knows what would happen if you pursued that. I was talking to Mike Johnson, who's the fourth most powerful Republican in Washington. About 3 days ago, we were talking about the potential for young people to be involved in the political sphere. And in our culture, appallingly, most youth involvement comes in the form of protest. And that's the fault of the idiot universities, as far as I can tell. Because basically what students are taught is that if something bothers them, which it might, then they should protest about it. It's like, well, you could do something about it instead of complaining about the people who are doing something.
And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. I read in Jung years ago this idea that I found extraordinarily compelling and useful, which was that every ideal is simultaneously and necessarily a judge. And so you imagine that the ideal is something that beckons to you, but you also pale in comparison to the ideal. And so by apprehending an ideal, you're also simultaneously judged, and the higher the ideal, the more intense the judgment in some real sense. I think that's partly why people are terrified of great art, like Michelangelo's David. I read a great commentary on that. The commentator suggested that the statue calls upon you to be far more than you are. So there's that judgment, and I think part of what happens to Moses here is that he's afraid to look upon God, the God of Abraham that calls people to adventure, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, the God that calls people to adventure and sacrifice and then out of slavery as well, is that ideal that's ultimately terrifying in some real sense. And so Moses hides his face, for he was afraid to look upon God.
Moses' reaction to God's call is also one of attention. You know, he says, here am I, here I am. That's all he can do. He can just, I'm here and I'm paying attention to what is happening. And this phrase is so important that it's repeated in other places in the Bible. You see it in the story of Samuel, for example, who has that same reaction. He hears the call and all he can say is, I am here and I am attending now. And so it's interesting to see that this idea of attention continues on in the story as well.
Well, it's this idea of attention is extremely important, because it's easy to think of attention and cognition, let's say, or even rationality as somehow equivalent, but they're importantly different, because rationality builds towers of Babel, let's say, and rationality makes presumptions about the world. But attention is a precondition for revelation and for rationality. And attention is in and of itself a kind of openness to the horizon of transformation. And the more, I would say, there's a direct connection between being attentive and even being capable of healing in some real sense. So if you're a clinician, one of the things you learn, and Carl Rogers, the clinician, was a particularly potent writer on this notion that attentive listening in and of itself has a curative capacity. You let people unfold in front of you, or you encourage them to unfold in front of you. And that's not even analytic thought. There can be a strategic component of it, but mostly it's just the devotion of attention. And attention also, in some real sense, sheds light on the darkness, because we only see what we attend to, and what we don't see, or what we don't perceive in the broadest sense, is in some real sense not even there. Here's something that's really worth considering given what we've been discussing. So imagine you cast a vision onto the unknown to pull yourself forward in faith. Okay, so then the question is, where does the vision come from if it's a proper vision? And I would say the answer to that, neurologically and psychologically, is that it comes from the proper interplay between chaos and order. It really does do that, because the order is what you already know, and the chaos is what's yet to be learned, right? And there's a meaningful conjunction of those two. And I say meaningful because when those two are conjoined, that's when you get the experience of meaning, like you do when you listen to music, because it's partly predictable and partly unpredictable. And in a conversation that's compelling, it refers to what you know because you can't understand it, but it refers to what you don't know because it wouldn't be interesting. And when those are optimized, then this spirit of meaning that's pulling you forward. And what the spirit of meaning manifests itself in its initial phases from the Jungian perspective is a vision of the potential future.
When I explain to the audiences, and this is especially true, seems to be especially true of men, of young men, but not so young even, to say, look, you have an ethical obligation to lift the heaviest load you can possibly conceive of, and that's the primary call to adventure in life. And that call to adventure is so worthwhile that it justifies the particularity. Everybody, it's like lights go on, they think, I see. So you need a meaning to set against the suffering and to protect you against that temptation towards malevolence. You need that. Well, where's the meaning to be found? Well, it's not happiness. It's not short-term pleasure. It's not self-development. It's not self-esteem. It's none of those things that are so focused on the individual psyche even. Yeah. It's literally the stumbling uphill towards the city of God with your burden. People go, well, that's where the meaning is, and they know that because they know responsible people. They know they admire responsible people. They already got that. Say, well, that's what you should become, and they think. And not only that, that's what you could become, because that's what you are in the deepest sense.
Yes.
So there's this idea in Cain and Abel that you have to make sacrifices in order to stay on the good side of God. And so I thought about that practically, say, not so much metaphysically, but practically, and realized that that was equivalent to the discovery of time, of the future, because we do act, and this is a peculiar discovery of human beings, and maybe a consequence of our expanded intelligence, is that we're actually aware of the future, and we actually treat the future as if it's something that you can bargain with. Now, partly it's because the future is other people, and they remember your reputation, they remember your past actions, and if you do someone a favor, then that favor is in some sense stored up in the future. So you could think about the future as a place of judgment about your moral actions. And it's not that far from that to imagining a God who's keeping track of that, or who even is that. But in any case, the idea of sacrifice emerges in the story of Cain and Abel. And Cain and Abel both make sacrifices to God in order to stay on his good side, let's say. And what a sacrifice means is that you give up something of value in the present so that you can improve the future. And that's no different from what we call discipline. It's exactly the same thing. It's just the concretely acted out version of that. And so, the idea basically was that, well, God was in the transcendent heavens. And the first question would be, well, why is that? And it's like, well, if you go out on a really dark night and look up at the sky, you have a sense of what's beyond you, what's transcendent, what's infinite. And so to associate that with the highest of values is a reasonable association, right? From an emotional point of view. So it's not particularly primitive. It's a smart metaphor, or it's a smart intuition and it's above you. And we tend to think of when you're moving towards an ideal that you're moving up, that you're moving above, you're moving to the mountaintop, right? You're going up, not down. And so it all sits within that same framework, and it's partly because when you go up, like on a mountain, you can see for long distances, right? So all those things are tangled together. So anyways, so the idea is that you have to give up something of value now so that you make the future better. And sometimes it's even something you love now, and that's a good example too, because often the things that stop us from moving forward are our attachments to things that we should no longer be attached to, right? And in fact, you can almost make that definitional. If you're not moving forward in your life, there's a high probability that you have some idea or some mode of action or some habit that you're so in love with that you won't let go of it. In the story of Adam and Eve, once Adam and Eve are thrown out of the garden because they become prematurely self-conscious and prideful in some real sense, God is presented as the spirit that you walk with when you walk unself-consciously in relationship to the highest in the garden. And that's actually an experiential reference, as you imagine you're having a particularly good day in a particularly beautiful garden, like the day we had today. It's like, are you closer to God? Well, the answer is, experientially, well, yes, because you feel that your existence is imbued with a deep sense of appropriate significance. And that's not a rational, secondarily derived argument. It's primary. It's a primary experience. And part of what the biblical corpus is trying to do is to lay out the nature of the spirit that inhabits you when you're oriented towards the highest possible good, and to point out that that's phenomenological, it's experiential, it's existential, it's embodied. It's not a secondary overlay of the description of the nature of the world on the world. That's not what the biblical corpus is trying to do. So in the story of Cain and Abel, what's God? God is that which calls you to make the appropriate sacrifices and calls you on it when you don't. And try to escape that and see what happens. We know perfectly well, that that's a pathway to hell. And you might say, I don't believe in hell, and I would say, that means you don't know anything. Noah, who is God, or what is God in the story of Noah? The spirit that calls the wise to prepare in the face of crisis. Do you abide by that or not? Well, you do if you're wise, and you do if you care about the people around you. Abraham, what's God? The spirit that calls the inappropriately luxuriating out to the terrible adventure of their life, and that then requires of them the highest possible sacrifice to obtain the highest possible goal. In Exodus, what's God? The spirit that lays tyranny to waste. The spirit that guides you through the desert of the soul. The spirit that orients you towards the promised land and imbues you with the enthusiasm that allows you to make your way out of the tyranny and through the desert. And each story is part of a circumambulation, a narrative circumambulation that's attempting to represent the union of virtues that could be embodied in perception and action that constitute the pinnacle of the pyramid. And that, by the way, pyramid, that's Mount Sinai. That's the proper hierarchical organization of society. That's the aesthetic model for the construction of the Ark of the Covenant. It's all of that simultaneously. It's the Egyptian pyramid with the gold cap. The question is, what's the cap? What's at the highest?
Well, that is the mystery. What should be placed in the highest place? We already said, well, something better be, because if nothing's placed in the highest place, then there's nothing in the highest place. And what's the consequence of that? Well, to return to that theme, anomie, anxiety, overwhelming dread, psychological destabilization, and the absence of joy. And there is no escaping from that except by solving the problem. But it's worse than that, because this hierarchy of perceptual prioritization unites us socially. So here we are in a theater, and we've seen many examples of theaters today, including the amphitheater, where it's a concentric circle that focuses everyone's attention on the same spectacle. Well, that's the definition of a culture, is that everyone's attention is focused on the same spectacle. And so the hierarchy of perceptual prioritization and action that unites you psychologically is also the same structure that unites us socially. And so that means the kingdom of God is within and without simultaneously in some most fundamental sense. And you might say, well, we don't need a superordinate ethic to unite us. And I would say, okay, then we're not united. And so what are we if we're not united? And the answer is, well, we're a house divided against itself. And what's the consequence of that? Everyone, that's the Hobbesian nightmare, right? That's not the noble savage, that's the Hobbesian nightmare. It's like, you and I, we cannot play together. We cannot focus our attention on the same point and cooperate and compete amicably, peacefully, productively, and generously towards that point. And that's not nothing. That's the death of God. That's the rise of nihilism. That's the emergence of a corrosive and destabilizing and deep cynicism. And it's the death of joy and enthusiasm. And so we might say, well, what do we have in the absence of God if God is the spirit that animates us to action and perception in relationship to the highest good? And the answer is, we have the catastrophe of the death of God that Nietzsche referred to when he announced the death of God and said simultaneously that we were the murderer of all murderers and that we would never find the water to wash away the blood. And that is definitely the situation we're in now. And hopefully, we'll all wake up enough at the individual level to play out that catastrophe of valuelessness within our own souls and render the judgment that's necessary upon each of us in ourselves by our own voluntary assent, or we'll act out the failure to do that in the external world. And that's the decision, as far as I can tell, that in some real sense, and maybe in a sense that's more real than ever before in the entire history of the world, even though this battle has been playing out eternally, that's the choice that confronts us now. Wake up. We have a moral burden to bear, and that's the adventure of our life. That's the other thing so interesting about the Abrahamic story, is that God calls Abraham out of his luxurious slumber and sends him into a catastrophe. Tyranny, starvation, war, brutal. But he has the adventure of his life. You might say, well, it's the adventure of your life that justifies the catastrophe of your life. It's not some simple-minded, juvenile hedonism or desire for comfort. That's not what we're built for. We're built for the adventure of our lives. And where do you find that? You find that in orienting yourself to the highest possible good in all ways and speaking the truth forthrightly along that pathway.
There's more to us than there is to the horror. As nature is, bent on our destruction, bad as culture is, tyrannical and bloody, back as far as you can look, as malevolent as you are in the darkest part of your heart, and that's plenty malevolent. The possibility that's within you that can well up, the courage and the truth and the ability and the skill and the willingness to set things right, if you are willing to set them right, is more powerful than all of that. And so it's so interesting. It was proof for me of an old saying I read from Carl Jung. It's an alchemical motif, in sterquilinus inventur, which is what you most want to be found will be found where you least want to look, essentially. And it's so interesting because it means that if you're willing to turn around and to stand up, say, and stand up straight and face the darkness like fully, what you discover at the darkest part is the brightest light. And that's something that's so much worth discovering, because there's going to be terrible darkness in your life. And it's going to make you cynical and bitter. And it could easily be that you're just not looking at it enough. Because if you looked at it enough and you didn't shy away and you brought everything you had to bear on it, you'd find that there was more to you than there was to the horror. You know, I watched my father-in-law. I'll end with this. And you know, you don't know, because you're not bringing your A game to the table with all that cynicism and bitterness and resentment and willful blindness and avoidance. Maybe you're playing at 60%. It's not good enough because there's too much of what's bad for 60% to be good enough. It's like you need 90% or 95% or 100%. When about 15, 20 years ago, my mother-in-law developed frontal temporal dementia, which I wouldn't recommend. You know, it's one of those degenerative neurological diseases like Alzheimer's, and those bloody things are like they're in the top echelon of awful. You know, you watch a person deteriorate before your eyes. It's a lengthy, lengthy death. And it was slow. And her husband, he lived in this little town that I grew up in, about 3,000 people. And he was quite a character, man. Everybody knew him. I bought him a Foghorn Leghorn t-shirt once, because that's kind of what he was like. He was loud and sort of bombastic, but he stood up straight, I can tell you. And he played the fool a little bit, mostly for the amusement of people, but he was no damn fool. And I always admired him and liked him. And the feeling was mutual, thank God, since I married his daughter. And, you know, he drank a lot with his crazy friends up in northern Alberta, and he wasn't at home a lot because he was working a lot. And you know, he was kind of a party animal about town, but a good businessman and a good man. And then his wife got sick, and they moved to another town. And, you know, he took care of her for like 15 years. It was unbelievable as she deteriorated, you know, and she got more desperate to have him around, and her love for him never went away. Even as she lost herself almost completely, she would always light up when he came into the room, you know, and he took care of her right till within weeks of her death. He had to finally put her in an old folks home because he was no longer strong enough to lift her up from the chair. And we interacted with him a lot, you know, because we were trying to help him figure out how to cope. And we had signs put up in the house, electronic signs that would tell her when he was leaving, so that she would know where he went. And we had recordings in the bathroom so that she knew what to do when she went into the bathroom. And we tried to do everything we could to not make this absolutely bloody, atrocious experience complete hell. And he participated the whole way, you know, and it was really something to see. It was really it left me with a tremendous sense of admiration for him, but not just for him, but for people who can do that, you know. And if there was a new decline, he took it on, and he didn't complain about it. And he tried to do what he could, you know, and like, it was no picnic, don't get me wrong, but it wasn't hell. And then we were all gathered around the deathbed, my wife's mother's deathbed, and the family was there, and they got along pretty well, you know. And her sister's a palliative care nurse, and the other one's a pharmacist, and none of them are particularly afraid of illness and death. You know, they're a pretty tough group. And so, you know, they made sure their mother's lips were wet while she was no longer eating or drinking, and tried to make her comfortable. And they're around the deathbed, and they were kind of getting along, you know. It wasn't Family Feud at mother's death time, and that was kind of nice. And she died, and that was that. But it wasn't just that, because the fact that the family had coped with it well and nobly and honorably, I would say, brought them together. They were closer afterwards than they were before. And they all had more respect for their father. And then in the old folks' home, he met another woman who had a husband there who had Alzheimer's, and they got to know each other, and he died after a while, and she died after a while, and then a few months later they started going out, and then eventually they had a relationship, and now they live together. And so he gained something. Like, it wasn't that he replaced what he lost, you know what I mean? Because he still has pictures of his wife up in his house, and she was the love of his life, and that's not going away. But his family respected him more, and everybody pulled together more, and it wasn't hell at the deathbed, it was just tragedy, and the family pulled together more. And that was a good example of how you can extract at least a certain amount of light out of what's dark, even at a personal level. And it's worth asking yourself. It's like, drop what you're doing that's foolish, that you know is foolish, and pick an aim that's worthwhile, to make things better for yourself, like you're worth taking care of, like you're worth something, and to surround yourself with people who believe the same and who are rejoicing in your accomplishments and unhappy when you fail, right? And you're comparing yourself to your accomplishments of yesterday and not to someone else's today, so that you're not jealous and bitter. And you put your own house in order so that you're not cursing the world when some of its disarray might be your fault. And you're trying to pursue something meaningful, and you're doing your best to tell the truth and all of that. And then you see what happens. Who the hell are you? You think you're a miracle of some bloody bizarre sort. We've been around for 3.5 billion years. Every single one of your relatives propagated successfully. And here you are, against all possible odds, in this world of hell in some sense, and bitterness and tyranny and malevolence. And yet, God only knows what's inside you, this capacity for consciousness, the capacity to confront potential and to turn it into something good. That's us, man. That's the Western story. That's the individual as the cornerstone of the state. That's our responsibility, and it really is who we are. And so we need to know that, and we need to remember it, and we need to act it out. And then maybe we can see what we can do about it, and see how good we could make things. And maybe that would be the purpose of your damn life, right? Not to be happy. It's like, there's problems to be solved. Be happy after you solve the goddamn things, right? So I learned, because I looked at dark things, that I learned that the light was more powerful than the darkness as far as that I was concerned, and that people were capable, each of us, of remarkable things, and that we need to know that that's what we are. We're this consciousness that confronts potential with all its catastrophe. That's what we are. That's what makes us in the image of God. That's what gives us our intrinsic value. And that idea that we have intrinsic value, that's the bedrock presupposition of our state. We're going to question that, or we're going to live it out. Better to live it out. Find out who you are. Thank you very much.
One of the things you can be virtually certain of in life is that you don't get something you don't aim at. And one of the things that's interesting about that is often people will keep their goals fuzzy. Because one of the problems with specifying your goals is you specify your failures. Right? If the goal is really fuzzy, you're not sure when you fail, and then you can fool yourself. Really, but you can kind of keep it foggy. But you make your goals sharp and clear. Then, well, first of all, then you know what to aim at. And what's interesting is, your brain is set up so that it reorganizes the world around your aims. And that's not, I've also written about this in 12 Rules for Life quite extensively, and that's not a metaphor. Like, we don't see much of the world, because there's a lot of the world and there isn't much of us. And so we see what we aim at. We aim with our eyes. And here's an example. So, like, great apes don't really have much of a white in their eyes, but human beings do.
And the reason for that is that we've evolved to detect where everyone else is looking. And so if I can't tell where you're looking, I don't know what you're up to. And then, well, over time, that means I can't read you as well, and we're more likely to get in a dispute, and one or the other of us is more likely to get killed. But it also means that your probability of finding a successful mate decreases. So we've evolved to have this very, very visually evident eye. And so when we're looking at each other, we're always looking at our eyes, because then we can tell where someone is pointed, and then we can tell what they're up to. And so we're hunting creatures, like we're aiming at a moving target and trying to track it all the time. And so you have to specify your aim, and it's more than one aim. It's like you have a highest aim, which you might say is to be a good person, and then I would say, well, there's a more elaborated aim than that. It's like you want to be able to constrain malevolence and work to decrease suffering. It's something like that. That's the highest aim. And then you have to decompose that into the things you do each day, so that there's a definite connection between all the micro actions and the macro aim, and then that gives dignity to what you're doing. Why have a goal? Well, it's easy. No goal, no positive emotion. Because you experience positive emotion by noticing that you're moving towards a goal. And so if you don't have a goal, well, you can't have any positive emotion. So you better have a goal. And so you might say, well, what should the goal be? Well, we could start by saying, well, any goal is better than none. And then we might say, well, it should be a goal that other people will let you pursue, because otherwise it's going to be kind of difficult. And maybe they'll be even happy to help you pursue it. That would even be better. And maybe it's a goal that would enable you to learn how to pursue other goals while you pursue that goal. Boy, that would really be good. And so you can see that your goal is parameterized, but that doesn't mean that any old goal works. It means there's some goals that work nicely and some not so nicely. There are playable games and non-playable games. That's a good way of thinking about it. And you want to have a playable game. And there's a lot of them. Lawyer, plumber, actor, whatever. They're playable games. And it's not obvious which one's better, but it's certainly obvious which ones are sustainable and which ones are worse. And so there's a set of playable games, and you need to extract from that set of playable games a game that suits you. Enthusiasm and joy, happiness, let's say, is 100% dependent, as far as we can tell, on observations that you're progressing towards a valued goal. It's not attainment focused, that's satiation. You get something you want and you're satisfied about it. That's a whole different neurochemical system. But enthusiasm and joy that people associate with happiness manifests itself when you're moving towards a valued goal. So if you don't prioritize your goals because you don't exist within a structure of value, then you have no positive emotion. And positive emotion is half of forward-moving motivation. Well, in fact, in terms of forward movement, it's almost all the motivation, because the embodied manifestation of positive emotion is the movement towards a valued goal. That's what it is. That's why you have the positive emotion, because you are a creature that can move towards goals. And the emotional signaling of that is positive emotion. No goal, no positive emotion. No hierarchy of goals, dilution or eradication of positive emotion. Because if you're confused enough and you have 100 goals and you can't prioritize them, then every goal has 1% of the significance necessary to really move you forward. And so to be maximally motivated, you need to know why you're doing what you're doing, all the way up Jacob's ladder, all the way up. And that brings us to the notion of the macrocosm that's the heavenly hierarchy. And in some sense, it's a psychological macrocosm, although not in all senses, because it brings society into the purview. So here's a proposition. Any system of priorities is a structure of values. So you may or may not accept the proposition that you have to hierarchically arrange your perceptions. You also, by the way, have to do the same thing on the action front, because if you're inclined to do 10 things at once, you can do none. And consciousness, by the way, is a very narrow channel. And we generally can only concentrate on one thing at a time. And the reason for that, in some sense, is because we can only act out one thing at a time. And so not only
do you have to prioritize your perceptions, which are action-based anyways. You also have to prioritize what you're going to do, because you have to do the first thing first, and then the second thing, and the third thing, and that's obviously a structure of priority. And a structure of priority is a structure of comparative value, and a hierarchical structure of comparative value is an ethic. And so what that means, as far as I can tell, and this is something, if it's true, is that we cannot see the world except through an ethic. And I mean that literally as well as metaphorically. You literally cannot see the world or act in it. You cannot perceive the world except through a structure, a hierarchical structure of value, which is an ethic. And so then I would say, and here's something else to chew on for like 20 years, a story is a verbal description of a hierarchy of perceptual and action prioritization. And the reason that we're so attracted to stories is because it's so difficult to perceive and act in the world that we're hungry at the level of soul for a narrative that represents to us a hierarchical ethos that we could embody as a model for emulation. And so that's what our stories are. They're models, they're ritual models for emulation, most fundamentally. And the anti-hero story, well, that's easy enough to contend with. It's like, watch this person who ends up in catastrophe and hell and do the opposite of whatever it is they're doing. And so that's a powerful lesson, because there's something very compelling, as we said before, about very powerful negative emotion. And so even if you don't believe in heaven, you might be able to conjure up a belief in hell. And if you can't, I would say, well, you're either not using your imagination, or you're hiding, or so far you're just lucky. But I wouldn't expect, and so you can certainly see the catastrophe and even the hellish catastrophe beckoning, and you might think plotting a route that would make that the least likely seems to be a good idea. And so part of the reason that we're fascinated by villains and supervillains, for that example, or part of the reason we're fascinated and endlessly so with figures like Lucifer and Satan, is because we're attempting to flesh out the nature of the antithesis to the worst kind of hierarchy of values. And that's gripping to us. It's gripping to us. Now there's more to it as well, because we also will turn our attention to the negative to fortify ourselves against the negative in preparation for confrontation with the negative. And so we can do that through use of fiction. And that's what we're doing, for example, at least in part, when we do such strange things as amuse ourselves with horror films. Partly what we're trying to investigate is like, what's up? What does up mean? What does it mean? Is there such a thing? Now, one thing to remember is that if you don't erect a hierarchical structure with something to aim at, you got no positive motivation, because you experience positive motivation in relationship to a goal, not from attaining the goal. That's satisfaction. And besides, it's fleeting. You know perfectly well. You graduate from university, poof, next day you have a problem, which is what do you do next? And that's a tough problem. It's not like you've solved your problems by winning that game. You just introduced the problem of having to introduce another game. So it's unreliable as a source of positive emotion, but what's reliable is you set a goal and you try to attain it, and then that gives your life, that literally provides your life with meaning.